that you're looking for on the transportation side?
That is definitely a big key, one of the levers you've got. That's why land use policy was in that list of things that I just mentioned there. There's the siting land use policy and there's that land use policy. They're both important, but I would argue for that one being harder and more important. There are solutions on the siting of renewables much more than there are so on convincing a lot of people about where they should live and work. One of the challenges is on pace and scale. There's not a lot of good data about how much you can depend on that kind of transition to help. If I had to guess, I would say that would be worth 10% of your transportation solution. And maybe if you're lucky, a quarter, recognizing you've still got a good ways to go. So the trick is whether you can flip over and really have an entirely different looking transportation system. The challenge is, does that come at a density less than Manhattan, like less than New York City, where there aren't, there's nowhere in Vermont that's that dense? Are we proposing that, downtown Bristol, Vermont be built up to be that dense? Right. So, the structure of Vermont may put a limit on how far you can go there, but it's definitely true. I'll put this the other way: if you do that wrong, this becomes really, really hard. Right? It can be a red flag that pushes you the wrong way.
So, because transportation is a third,
right?
Does anybody else have a transportation-related question? Sure, Matt.
No, yes, I do. Transportation appears to be one of the largest obstacle towards reaching some of the goals in the comprehensive energy plan. And I was wondering, apart from reducing our current energy use by driving less and carpooling and whatnot, how do you think we're going to build a transportation system that is run on renewable energy? Do you think plug-in vehicles are going to be a big thing? Or?
So your two options basically are electrification and biofuels, right? Those are your two biggies. There's natural gas is an option potentially, but that's not renewable, so it doesn't really help you get to your renewable goals. So basically, you're left with electricity and biofuels. There are lots of really big advantages to electricity and lots of big advantages to biofuels. I'll give you the advantage to electricity, which is and why I think that one will win and is deserving of the policy support that it's going to get. One, you can just get by the vehicles, the motors themselves. The vehicles themselves are so much more efficient. So just in terms of how much energy you put in the car and how much energy it takes you to get somewhere, an electric vehicle is just a lot more efficient. And so particularly then the trick becomes cleaning the electric supply that went into the car. The nice thing there is we have lots of regulatory levers about electric supply. Electric supply is procured by regulated utilities that respond to policy pressures, et cetera. There's that advantage. And also the price of electricity is regulated because we have regulated monopoly utilities. So having price stability as opposed to the price of gas spiking up and down as it does seemingly on a regular basis, but you just know, okay, it just always costs me 9 cents a kilowatt hour to charge my vehicle overnight. And it will cost me 9 cents next year and maybe 9.2 cents the year after that because of inflation. But that level of stability, keep the economy from being so tightly coupled to the price of oil. The problem with biofuels is that they're intimately coupled to the price of fuel, price of fossil fuel. If it's a pure drop-in fuel and it's totally easy to use and you can put it right in your tank, someone will sell it for exactly the price that someone will pay for that gallon in China or India, right, or Europe. So that it doesn't help with the energy security piece unless you yourself personally make the fuel, which is the argument in favor of on-farm biodiesel production and such. But I don't know that scales to match the whole challenge.
Thank you.
So let's give Brittany short.
Oh, this is just stepping off that. Well, you're talking a lot about electric vehicles, but who's to say anyone's going to get an electric vehicle? I mean, it's like a lot of reliance on a consumer choice that you're not totally certain of.
Right. So one of there are a couple things going for us. One, technological change 3-4 years ago, you couldn't go down to the dealership and buy an electric vehicle. Now there's 14 or 15 you can pick from. So actually having it available gives us, it's a proof of principle that yes, you can build these things and yes, you can sell them, right? So you feel a little more confident in that position than you would have a few years ago. We do have, and this is where policy and mucking with the market comes in, but we have regulatory levers. We have CAFE standards. The easiest way to hit CAFE standards is to sell some fraction of EVs to help keep your total average mileage up. California has air emission standards that basically require or mandate the sale of some fraction of the vehicles to be electric plug-in, and Vermont has signed on to that. So there are rules on the books for air quality's sake that require those vehicles to be here and to be sold, which basically ends up putting pressure on the car makers, and you start to actually see it now. The regs are actually kicking in where, well, for example, evidence. Tesla makes a bunch of money, not from selling their cars, although they make money from selling their cars because they're all expensive, but also from the fact that they're selling the credits for having sold an electric car to all the other car makers who need to have those credits. So, and if you at the end of model year sales going on now, you can buy a plug-in Prius for the same price as a normal Prius because they're willing to eat that in order to get the credit they need for regulatory reasons. So the fact that you can go down and lease a Nissan Leaf for $200 and something a month, pretty comparable to the price that you would lease any other small car. Getting rid of all the economic disincentive you had up front, plus that it's really cheap to run. So that the hope is you just make it a dead simple, obvious choice for people. But as one of the reasons it's hard is that unlike the electric supply side, we don't just have thou shalt buy, right? It doesn't work that way for cars, unless you're a teenage boy in a Ford pickup truck.
And like in Vermont, we have a fleet of 600,000 vehicles.
Right.
So it would take quite a while to transition. So there is, by the way, a student engineer who has a test pilot for electric BMW, is that right?
Yeah.
Do you want to say a word about that? Might interest you.
Yeah, my family is testing, we're like testing one of the cars from BMW, which is really interesting, but it's just not, like I wouldn't have chosen to buy that car. It's fun to test, it's a fun drive, but it's not extremely practical. Like it's a good daily driver for my mom to get back and forth to work. But it started off at a 100-mile range, and we've had it for a year and a couple months, and it's already like the range is about 80 miles now. It's just batteries decline as they get older. And I don't know if it's a great technology to like buy, to lease, absolutely, but not to buy.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges of dealing with fast-moving technology is that even folks who put in solar panels 10 years ago feel like or 5 years ago, 3 years ago, feel like they massively overpaid because they could have waited just a little bit and prices came down. Battery technology will get better. But one of the key things you said out there is it's a good daily drive for your mom, right? The trick will be finding for electric vehicles the niches and the uses. Yes, it'll be the other car, the car that gets used for the around town parts and not the long drives. Some folks will be easier first adopters more than others, but the technology will improve, the infrastructure will improve, and we have, for all of it seeming like this is super urgent, we do have 37 years, which is time to turn over the vehicle fleet about twice. So if by 2030, 25% of the cars that are sold are plug-in, you're not that far off, because those cars, even the 2030 cars, will be out of the fleet by 2050. So, you got to turn it bit by bit and recognize that having 3% of sales would be a huge win, even though 97% of people didn't abide by your message and didn't go buy an EV because it wasn't right for them. Well, next time.
With your car that has an 80-mile range, if you live in Vermont, you're getting 40 miles each way, you're probably going to be ghosting the last few. So is there some kind of plan for the infrastructure for fast charge stations around town, like work where they live, or just at restaurants or hotels or stuff like that, so people don't? We've got pieces of culture just pulling in a gas station. 5 minutes later, you're good to go another 400 some miles. It's going to be quite a change unless we can provide an infrastructure to ease people onto.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so one random fact, and then I'll answer that question a little bit. When you go up to the gas station and you push that nozzle into your car, you're wielding like 6 megawatts, right? So recognizing that that's, 2/3 of the production of the Georgia Mountain Wind facility you can see north of here, right? In your hand at the gas station. So figuring out a pure electric way to do that, kind of a challenge. So the fastest chargers are slower than that, but they're still pretty good. So infrastructure. Figuring out how much to build out is one of these infrastructure choice questions. Evidence is that 80% of all charging would happen at home, or 85. The bulk of the rest happens at workplaces. So we're trying to figure out, or the time when cars are just sitting still and they might as well be getting charged, right? I mean, that's the thought process is to get away from the idea that you ever have to stop at a gas station. Your car is just always charged when you get in it, because it happens to have been charged wherever it was, until such time as we get to the point that the cars have long enough range that you don't need that so much. So home, and then workplace. And then the thought is, where we've got public infrastructure now is with receptive businesses who recognize that folks who drive EVs will likely spend more in their store, will hang out for a while. They'll spend longer because they're waiting for the car to charge. So trying to figure out, making that actually a business opportunity. Maybe even if you're giving away the electricity, Healthy Living on Dorset Street, South Burlington, there's a very nice, artistically designed charging station. And you figure somebody comes in and parks, well, they're going to actually sit inside. They're going to order from the deli counter. They're going to go do their grocery shopping. It's going to be worth it as a business transaction. So figuring out those business models and figuring out how to make that work. On the through traffic side of things, we are trying to lay the groundwork for what will eventually be hopefully a more of a fast charging network that would run down 89, that would run down Route 7, that would run down I-91, so that you can stop for 20 minutes, get a cup of coffee, charge, go to the bathroom, get back in your car and go, in more like the current model. But you won't need that every 3 miles. You need it every 30.
So we have about another 15 minutes with ASA, and I know there's some non-students, but I'm going to give the students the first chance. Patsy, did you have a question, Sal, for? Yeah. Did anybody want to move on? We're on transportation, which is the third. Obviously, one of the other big obstacles or challenges ASA and we all face is home heating. Anybody, you did one, Scott. Does anybody, I know a bunch of you wrote about this and how we heat our homes. This conversation is going on about natural gas. Jane, jump on that for me, Jane.
So my question, I guess, stemmed from there's a lot going on with natural gas. There's the big meeting, rally, question in Middlebury tomorrow. So my question was, in a time when Vermont is trying to move towards 90% renewable, how can we really justify building the biggest addition to fossil fuel infrastructure that we've seen in almost 50 years? There's a second part, I guess
That's fine. Do you want to step back and explain to me how to heat this is a...
Yeah, so I mean, here, you won't be able to read the wedges, but largely homes, businesses in the state are heated with fuel oil and propane, with a little bit of Caro and a little bit of natural gas. It happens that Franklin and Chittenden counties have natural gas, and Vermont Gas has proposed extending a pipeline down to serve parts of Addison County with natural gas. So I'm going to be a little bit reluctant to comment on this in great detail. It's a pending docket before the Public Service Board. People who work for me are witnesses and all the rest of that. But the thinking, as laid out in the Comprehensive Energy Plan, is that switching to natural gas from propane and from fuel oil is a greenhouse gas win. I know there's some contention about that point. it's a greenhouse gas win, and it's a big economic win. The cost of natural gas as it stands now is significantly less per BTU than these other fuels. The bigger policy question is one that we struggle with. Is, okay, so you've got this big economic win. One of the things that state energy policy are supposed to be going for is economic vitality and affordability, so check, we're good. But it doesn't necessarily meet all the other pieces, and so figuring out how to make that balance work, recognizing, for example, that there are going to be end uses, even in that 90%, there's 10% that's not renewable. And what is in that 10%? What's the most important things to have be in that 10%? If that 10% is natural gas, we're better off environmentally than if that 10% is fuel oil. We're better off economically. So figuring out, natural gas can double or triple and still fit inside that 10%. So figuring out how that's supposed to balance, recognizing maybe natural gas ends up getting used for heavy trucking, replacing diesel instead of biodiesel, depending on which direction the manufacturers go. We wouldn't want the state to be unable to have heavy trucking or have to pay extra for our fuel because we don't have access to natural gas. There are industrial processes that really do benefit from having natural gas, or they need to burn something that burns sharp and clean at a point, right? What are your choices there? Basically propane and natural gas. Well, one of those is somewhat better from a greenhouse gas perspective and a lot cheaper. Is that a win? So, right, but figuring out how to use a bridge, but only to the extent that you need to, and figure out how to get off the bridge if that's part of, figuring out how to be flexible, it's a challenge. And it's thinking about building out infrastructures, figuring out how to make that work for the state as a whole. It's not obvious always.
All right, well, let's stay. Does anybody want to stay with this, the home heating, natural gas discussion? Yes, please.
Like response, you said, sorry. I guess who makes or like what determines the final decision on the give and take aspects of sustainability? So in this case, the pipeline, since there's no perfect energy solution, and in this case, there's also strong opposition. So how do you kind of make that determination? Like who makes the final call?
Can you maybe repeat that?
Yeah. So basically, the question is who makes the call on defining what this balance actually is and how you strike the balance, and recognizing that there will be passionate arguments in favor and passionate arguments against on any aspect of this. So in the particular case of a regulated utility doing something, the decision gets made by the Public Service Board. Instead of gubernatorial appointees, over time they're not appointed by the sitting governor necessarily, and their staff who look at all the evidence and look at the law and how they're supposed to weigh this or that. Our department weighs in attempting to look at the totality of the evidence and represent the public as a whole somehow, recognizing that individual members of that public almost always disagree with some aspect of what we are advocating for, and try to come up with some mash of what is the public interest. Frankly, one of the things that happens there, which has its pros and cons, is that one of the ways you can judge the public interest is by the statements and the guidance of elected officials. The public elected folks, people in the legislature, the governor, others, to speak on their behalf, town select boards, et cetera. And so those folks and their opinions matter. The legislature, if they don't like the way that the statutes are being interpreted, they will call us out. They will call the Public Service Board over. They will read the Riot Act to folks. That's one of the things that they can do. There's, for all the discussion about natural gas now, you're 3 years behind the big wind equivalent, the same question. How do you determine against the interests potentially of folks who live in immediate adjacency to a wind turbine versus a broader societal need? It's a constant balancing act, and we're trying to look at all of the evidence, figure out based on the guidance in the statute and based on what, try to make the best case we can as to what would be in the public interest, and then eventually in a regulated case, a different set of people look at all of it, having heard the arguments against and before, and people who have one issue in the middle, and try to make a decision.
We will spend more time on this in the second part of this class because it's a key question. Who are the decision makers? We have this plan, but who are the people who make the decision? And ASA works for one arm of government, the arm that in a way represents us, the consumer advocate, and then there's this three-person board, a public service board, that makes these decisions based on all this evidence that they hear. So we'll spend more time on that, but it's a really important question for thinking about this plan. Did you have a question? You raised your hand earlier, no?
I did, but I'm not a student.
That's fine, I think we can,
Okay. I wanted to go back to electric cars. That's all right. So I'm curious because I don't know much about the physics of it. How long does it take to recharge a typical battery of a typical electric car? And what's the actual evidence that these batteries will get better over time? Not just hypothetical.
On the answer to the second one first, the fact that batteries today are better than batteries were 5 years ago, which are better than the batteries were 10 years ago, and today there are batteries in the lab that are better than the batteries today, and 5 years ago today's batteries were in the lab. So that's the the march of technological progress basically is the argument. Not a surety, but something worth taking into account. Well, there is no, fortunately at the moment, there is no such thing as a typical electric vehicle. Maybe that's a good thing. But an 80-mile range electric vehicle plugged in at home will take the night to charge, 8 hours or so to charge. There are faster chargers. Tesla supercharger can take a 200-mile car and charge it in 20 minutes. So, depending on the infrastructure that you have, you can charge much more slowly. If you plug into an outlet like the outlets in this room, it will take several hours to plug a 10-mile, to charge even just enough to drive 10 miles. But that's just on the circuitry in this room. So there's no one answer. We're just realizing today that one of the things that's likely to happen over time is that unlike now, where basically every car has comparable range, you have 10 to 13 gallons in your tank, and you'll all be able to drive hundreds of miles, and you stop and fill up. There will probably actually be market differentiation. Your entry-level little commuter car, $15,000, what you get for your kid when they turn 16, keep them close to home will be a cheap 40-mile car that's good for getting to and from school and friends' houses and whatever, but not for going to Montreal, right? Unless you want to have them spend a while charging. But that will be a lot cheaper than the 150, 200-mile range car that someone else might want to buy. And so you have to have a lot more stratification on that point in terms of what's actually available in the market. And you started to see that now.
okay, other questions? Yes, is it Charlie? Or, yeah.
Yeah.
Phone up if you could so we can hear you.
So I'm new to Vermont. I'm still kind of getting the lay of the land. But one thing I've heard a bit about is the new smart grid that Vermont is getting. I was wondering if you could just comment on how that's going to kind of work towards answering this question of how do we use energy.
Yeah, so a little bit of context. By roughly now, something like 85 or 90% of all electric meters in the state are so-called smart meters, which means that they're communicating on a regular basis with the utility to let the folks who are running the grid know that much more about where the demand is, how electricity is being used, building by building rather than just, well, this circuit has this amount of demand on it, which is about a level of resolution they've had before. They also have a much greater transparency and communication, even to get the circuit level information much more real time than we've had in the past. So examples of how that might matter. The most obvious is an intermittent renewable integration, figuring out how to take solar scattered around on rooftops, small wind turbine here, electric vehicle plugged in there, and actually understand where the electricity is actually flowing so that you can get a better handle on balancing everything to make sure that you can get a lot of those intermittent resources on without causing instability, while still maintaining supply equals demand dead on like you have to make an electric grid work. So you actually understand where all your supply is and how it's doing, where all your demand is and what's happening to it. You can make those things line up so much better. The next level potentials that we're not there yet, we're not even there yet on what I just described in terms of actually being able to really harness that, but we're learning. You kind of have to build it out to see how it actually works to learn from it. But the hope is to be able to do things like better rate design. I mentioned earlier 9 cents a kilowatt hour to charge your car overnight. Well, now in Vermont, unless you're one of a very small minority, you pay the same amount, 15 cents-ish, to charge your car overnight as you do to charge your car in the middle of the afternoon. Well, the grid is probably better off if you're doing it overnight than in the afternoon. So maybe we should charge you 9 cents overnight and 20 cents in the afternoon. But until we actually have the level of resolution to do that, which these meters can enable us to do, we can't give those kinds of signals to sort of provide the right massage to people's behavior and reward them for behavior that's good and helpful for the grid as a whole. Helps us get the wind that's blowing in the middle of the night into cars instead of trying to depend on a stressed grid in the middle of the afternoon to get that energy into the car. So the hope is that we'll be able to put those pieces together. There are all sorts of other benefits around outage recovery and dealing with weather and various other things, but those are less to do with hitting these goals.
One or two more, and think about this. This whole semester, we're trying to figure out how realistic it is and how achievable it is and how the state's going to get to 90% renewable. All our energy, 90% renewable by 2050.
So I always wonder when people actually write these types of things, how they enact them in their personal lives.
Right.
So a couple of questions. How have you found that you've changed your lifestyle from learning all about this and writing this comprehensive energy plan? And then for college students, like I live downtown, I don't pay for my heat, thank God, but
Well, you do. It's in your rent.
no, it's not. Well, I mean, it is, but I pay the same as most people do, but not for the extra heating bill. So I don't really have control over where my heat comes from because of my landlord.
Right.
And I know that's written in the first volume of
Landlord-tenant, big problem. Yeah.
Yeah, so how do I personally change? Because, I mean, I'm not about to go buy an electric car because I already have a car, or, you know, how do
Yeah.
you suggest college students approach this problem?
Right. I guess the first thing I should say is that if you live downtown and generally walk or bike up the hill, you're already a third of the way there, more so than many folks, and you should give yourself credit for that. You could have chosen, in theory, to live in Essex and drive into UVM on a regular basis, and you didn't, right? In terms of me personally, even before we published the comprehensive energy plan, I still take the bus to Montpelier every day. I live in Burlington and take the bus to Montpelier. It's great. Somebody else drives. There's Wi-Fi. Why would I drive, right? But that happens to be nicely consistent and compatible with doing the kinds of things we're trying to do. I rewrote one of my own actual contributions to the plan was that I rewrote the heat pumps section to reflect what was then pretty new and is still pretty new, the idea that there are actually cold climate heat pumps that will actually work in Vermont. Electric heat pumps. There used to be heat pumps that people would try and they conk out at 15 degrees. Well, it gets colder than 15 degrees in Vermont. You need something else. You might as well just install something else and be done with it. And then there's geothermal heat pumps, which are very capital intensive, much more expensive. But just emerging are cold climate heat pumps. And while I haven't installed them yet, I've done the math. So as soon as cold climate heat pumps become a little bit better, out goes my electric resistance heat, in comes a cold climate heat pump. So just, little recognition changes in, I happen to be a homeowner. I can make those kind of choices, unlike you. So on the heating front, being a tenant and not seeing your bill, unfortunately, part of the answer is, to the extent you can turn the thermostat down, even though it doesn't help your pocketbook at all, it's still a good thing to do, right? In theory, if your landlord doesn't just pocket the difference, that should help keep your rent lower, right? So you will see it, you pay it. It's just hidden inside your rent. But one of the we have asked there's people pledging to make their next car an electric car, right? So if when you do go to buy a car, you graduate from UVM, you get a real job, you go out, you're going to get a car. Remember that, it takes 15 years to turn over the fleet. We're not asking people to go out and buy today a car they don't need, but when you do need a car, keep it in mind. It's that kind of decision making. When you are actually faced with a decision, to have that extra little check in your mind about is this the right thing from a broader perspective and not just from my own convenience and pocketbook. It's a hard ask sometimes. That's why we try to make convenience and pocketbook and the right thing all line up. But it's not always easy.
So I think we'll just take one more question, and again, Ace will probably stick around for 10 minutes or something. But we'll break after this. But Mieko, and I want to introduce Mieko again and say how thankful we are to the Clean Energy Fund to help support this, and that down the rest of the semester, I think the Clean Energy Fund is going to be taking, we'll hear more about that in class, proposals like this for future initiatives. Do you have a question or a comment?
Sure. I actually kind of have a more upswing and more relevant to this audience, considering that this plan it's ambitious in its own way. Lots of funds, there's a lot of funding mechanisms that need to be alternative funding mechanisms that need to be considered. But I want to think in context of the students here as they're thinking about their careers and graduating. What are the opportunities to, one of our things about Vermont is so many of our young people leaving this state, I guess, and reputation. How do we retain them with what is the kind of job market we can create for them to kind of meet this goal? What is the potential fields out there, or what should be considered? What should be studying now or getting internships looking at?
I'm not going to have a perfect answer to that, but understanding, so there's a whole range of engineering-esque related directions that I think, the smart grid question, figuring out how to harness that grid. Our utilities, a bunch of people are going to, the baby boomers are aging out and retiring. They're going to hire a bunch of smart young whippersnappers to come figure out how to run the grid going forward. So that sort of grid control, utility management type picture, and frankly, all the things that it takes to run a utility, all the decision making. Green Mountain Power has 500 employees. They're not all line workers. They're making all sorts of decisions and plans about carefully taking a company through the decisions that it has to make. Building science, understanding how buildings work, and the energy flows in buildings. Finance, mentioned before, the need to get capital, figuring out new and interesting ways to harness financial instruments. We're not going to invent the way necessarily the federal tax code is run, but plenty of folks take interesting ways of taking this piece and that piece and this piece and that piece and putting them together into repeatable models that can actually harness real capital. So figuring out how to get those pieces lined up, to figure out how to get us the couple $2 billion of capital we need, right, in reasonable sized chunks that you can get at reasonable cost. So just stream of consciousness here, but.
To be specific, what about that English major or that broad liberal arts major who doesn't have a specialty? What would you suggest for them to look at? Or consider trying?
So I'll just take that as a spur from a little more stream of consciousness. The first of these It's all right. First of these, changing hearts and minds, right? Figuring out how to talk to people, how to organize people, how to convince people, how to get those structures set up so that people will move in these directions. There are all different aspects. But I mean, in some sense, this is a good model list to work off of. You can think about how you fit your own future self into helping us with one of those directions, whether it's the engineers on the innovation side or the folks who are going to go off to law school who can help us with the regulatory policy structures, or the folks who are going to go off to Wall Street who can help us with the finance piece. And not necessarily, when I say going off to Wall Street, not necessarily moving to New York to do it, but figuring out how to take the money that we were spending every year on fuel oil and other things, it's just money that's circulating around and leaving the state, harness that, keep it here.
Do you take interns in your office?
Occasionally.
So that's something for us to consider. All right, so we're going to stop here. We're going to thank ASA, take 10 minutes, CDA 06, and come back.